Buenos dias. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our weekly update on COVID-19, a place in time in which we bring the state of art of business, corporate best practices, policy, and health so that you, Hispanic leaders, can take better decisions and are informed so that you can inform our communities. This is part of the Hispanic Response and Recovery Plan that we have put together since the end of March, in an effort to have a framework to mitigate the incredible impact, the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has in our Hispanic community. As every week, we're going to start with an update from Dr. David Nabarro from the World Health Organization, who's a special advisor for COVID-19. David.
Good day. I'm so delighted to join you all again for this regular podcast with the Hispanic Star. The reason why I'm dressed up in my suit today is that this is the second day of the annual World Health Assembly. This is the governing body of the World Health Organization. But this year, it's an assembly like no other. I'll tell you what they're normally like. Inside a huge room in the Palais des Nations, which is the headquarters of the United Nations in Geneva, and it's the second big base of the United Nations. The other one is in New York. But usually this time in May, several thousand delegates come together from around the world, representing 194 countries, to govern World Health Organization, which is the global organization that looks after the health of every person in the world, an organization that covers every different aspect of health and works really hard to try to ensure that every single individual is able to enjoy the best health they possibly can, whether it is mental health or physical health. And I used to work for the World Health Organization as a member of their staff, and I used to attend these meetings, and they're really important. But this year, because it's COVID year, the meeting is being held virtually, and it's short, it's only 2 days. Yesterday was the opening, and different leaders gave statements to the delegates through the a web platform. Today, they're discussing the one resolution of the Assembly, which is about the response to the COVID pandemic. There are controversies, as you would expect. Perhaps the first and most important one is what can be done to improve the speed at which different countries are able to get ahead of the virus and keep their people safe. And so there'll be a lot of discussion about the right way to do this, in particular, the new ways of living that have to be introduced to reduce the risk that this virus will cause big outbreaks and lead to widespread illness. And that's really important in poorer countries and for poorer people, because what we're finding is that poor people everywhere find it hard to maintain the physical distancing and other protective measures that are needed to keep themselves safe. It's one thing to be able to work from home and to keep your distance if you're wealthy. It's quite a different thing if you're poor and you don't have all the facilities necessary to maintain the physical separation that's so important to prevent the spread of this virus. And if you don't have water with which to wash your hands, all that makes life so much harder. And then in addition, as I've said on podcasts before, we find that the extra measures that are put in place to keep people apart from each other, what are sometimes called lockdowns, are really difficult for poor people. And I know that many of you have been really suffering as a result of this really quite tough approach to reducing the risk of infection. But there are other things that the countries coming together at the Assembly are focusing on. Let me give you 3 things that are really taking up time. The first is trying to work out how the virus first appeared and affected people. Did it actually come from animals in a wet market, which is a place where live animals are sold, in Wuhan, in China? Most people think that that's how it did start, because most new pathogens or things that cause disease appear from animals, and usually it's when people and animals are close together, especially wild animals. But there are other ideas of where this virus came from. So there's a big focus on trying to get to the bottom of how it started and getting the right investigation done. Secondly, there are people who are saying that the World Health Organization itself, which is a technical organization made up of many people like me who've spent their lives working on infectious disease, and saying, could the World Health Organization have done something earlier to try to stop the virus from spreading, and what mistakes were made, and trying to make sure that we learn lessons for the next time something like this happens. Understandably, different national leaders are quite frustrated that this virus has caused so much hardship to their people, and they want to be able to be sure that actually the World Health Organization acted quickly and properly without any biases right at the beginning in early January. And so there's a big request for an inquiry into how this outbreak started. Some of us have said, could the inquiry be postponed until we finish dealing with the virus, like with all the big outbreaks right now? Others are saying we've got to get to the bottom of it and what was done by the World Health Organization so as to learn lessons. And there's a little bit of dispute about that, with some saying that you don't, while you're in the middle of fighting a fire, stop firefighting in order to work out how the fire started. But I think a compromise will be found, and it's quite clear that an evaluation will have to be done now because there's so many countries who are demanding it. And then the third thing is a tricky one. There's a request come from the president of one Latin American country that's gained a lot of support, saying that if new treatments and new vaccines are developed, they should be made available to everybody and not just to those who've got money, not just the rich countries. It's what's called having fair shares of the intellectual property. So that will be debated as well. I'm hopeful that this afternoon, the draft resolution, which is the decision that's going to be agreed by the member states, including these three quite controversial areas, will be agreed, and that we will be able to get on with renewed effort to fight the virus and help people everywhere to live with this virus and to be able to go about their lives and to restart their economies with the minimum possible delay. But it's always difficult, and if you feel a little bit of stress in my voice, it's because I'm very hopeful that we won't end up with a big battle between governments, and that could be a challenge, but let's hope that common sense will prevail and that we will be able to move on to tackle the virus and to help everybody, as I say, live with the threat of the virus and not be sidetracked by the kind of political disputes that do crop up between nations that make things difficult. And as I end my remarks, I'd just like to spend special greetings to all of you in the Hispanic community everywhere. Please stay strong. Please remember that public health experts like me are looking out for you wherever we possibly can. We know that many of you are struggling. We know that many of you are facing difficulties in your homes and in your families, as well as in your workplaces, and you're worrying whether you're going to be able to see your relatives anytime soon because of travel problems and so on. Well, do keep letting us know. Keep telling our colleagues in the Hispanic Star organization the issues you face, and wherever I can, I will take up your cause and try to make sure that your needs are reflected in some of these big discussions that happen. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you again, Dr. David Navarro, who actually was running to, like he was a candidate to run the World Health Organization. He was a candidate, and I think that all of you probably have seen a lot of editorial discussion about the effectiveness of the World Health Organization or not. But some of the people that are here as an audience are running organizations that have thousands and thousands of Hispanics that really don't need the WHO to be discussing right now what went wrong and so on. They really need to make sure that there's pressure on vaccines and like delivery of food and delivery of good and medical care. So I think that there's a lot to be said, and I hope that this World Health Assembly happening in these 2 days can be more action oriented as opposed to rhetoric. They're like exercise. Gillian, Tett. Gillian, thank you so much for being with us. It seems like a week went fast, so fast. The chair of the editorial board and editor at large of the Financial Times. Gillian, welcome. You've been talking to us about the shape of the economy, whether it's like a V, a U, an L, a W, a heartbeat. Tell us a little bit about like what is the state of the global economy, particularly in the States. We've been feeling a lot of pressure from corporations to step up and change already and open up. What is happening, and what's your prognosis?
Well, Claudia, great to be back on the show, and greetings to all of you. Well, today's actually quite a big day, and we're going to get quite a good sense of what's happening in the economy, which I know is of great interest to everyone watching, because Chairman Jay Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, is going to be talking with Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, today in Congress about what is happening, both in terms of the economic direction, but also what they're doing to try and help. Now, the bad news is that Chairman Powell gave a talk a few days ago from the Fed, which was really quite downbeat and quite alarming. He said that this is not going to be a quick recovery, somewhat contradicting what the president said from the White House. And he also said that essentially it's going to be, a very highly uncertain pace of recovery, a long, hard, potentially quite dark period. And that what he's really concerned about is that many of the job losses we've seen, tragically, which have been absolutely astonishing, are going to become embedded, in the sense that it won't be easy for people who've lost jobs to come back quickly. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there is growing momentum for more help from the government for both people who've lost their jobs, but also companies trying to thrive and survive and come back. On the one hand, we're seeing a growing debate about the need to provide more small loans of businesses. Essentially, we're also hearing talk about trying to provide more help for individuals. And there's growing scrutiny of what is or is not happening to the mid-market lending program, which was supposed to be providing loans to medium-sized companies, which were neither small enough to qualify for the PPP, nor big enough to necessarily raise finance themselves. And at the same time, there's growing scrutiny of the Fed, and people are looking at whether it's finally going to start buying risky corporate assets this week as part of its program to try and support the financial markets. But the outlook is not good. And although we are starting to see some companies and businesses beginning to open their operations to a very limited extent in some of the states and regions which are reopening, I think what's becoming clear is that there won't be a magical sudden switching on of the light and everything goes back to normal if you think that what we had before COVID-19 was indeed normal.
Yeah, quite grim, I would say. Gillian, is there any you were talking about more corporate engagement and corporations that are surviving and adapting. Is there anything that you've seen as a pattern that you would like to share with us, so that again, either Hispanic companies or companies with a large footprint of Hispanics can learn about what you've seen as best practices or models?
Well, I think, as we touched on before, tech is absolutely critical. And finding ways to harness tech to basically not just enable workers to do their jobs from home, but also to reach out to companies and businesses and customers, most importantly, is absolutely essential. So that's one key point. And we are seeing companies, successful companies, managing to remodel themselves increasingly around a tech footprint. Another obvious point, which everyone involved in business knows about, is it's time to hustle big time for credit, because there are a lot of government assistance programs out there. Banks are providing some assistance, but you have to get out and hustle. And that's exhausting and difficult, I know, but some companies are indeed doing that pretty successfully. And I think the third point, really important point, is, as everyone knows, the economy does not exist like a laptop, in the sense that I think a lot of us, when this crisis first started, we spent so many years of our lives recently getting used to this idea that if something goes wrong with our laptop or cell phone, if all else fails, just switch it off, wait 10 seconds and reboot it and restart, and it will come back as it was before. I mean, that action is so intrinsic into our lives that without even thinking about it, we've almost unconsciously adopted that meme And we're kind of projecting this, or we were initially, onto what we thought was going to happen with lockdown. You know, Steve Mnuchin, when he talked about the lockdown, treated it like the ultimate reboot. Just switch the economy off, reboot, and everything will go back. And what's very clear is that is not going to happen. Basically, we are seeing not just a tremendous economic shock, but also economic disruption. And the companies that emerge from this, and the businesses and consumers and individuals that actually emerge well, will be those which can rethink their model, try and jump into the new world of tech, of digital learning, of digital platforms, of less travel, less person-to-person interaction, and try to find services that tap into those needs. And there absolutely are businesses out there which are doing that, and there are also individuals. It is not easy, it's scary, it's difficult, it's confusing. But as I've said before, it's going to require brave entrepreneurs, and I am sure that the Hispanic community in many ways is filled with more of those than many other sectors of the population right now.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with you. I think that we're disproportionately affected, but we're also somehow disproportionately equipped with that resourcefulness and, you know, like finding ways, and entrepreneurial. And when you were talking, I could see Jesus Mantas from IBM, when you were talking about tech, just saying yes, because that's actually what he's been, you know, like talking about. And Ramiro Cavezos on how important it is to make sure that we provide technical assistance to entrepreneurs and small businesses. So thank you, Gillian. Tett. Bret Stephens, op-ed columnist of the New York Times, a Hispanic star himself. Bret, last time you were talking about like the size of the bite is massive, and this is not going to be, you were talking about like $6 trillion or something like that for the economy. What's your take, and what's your update for this week?
Well, what I've been thinking a lot about follows from some of the points that Gillian made with respect to the economy. I thought her description of the fallacy of the laptop was priceless, and hope it shows up in a column. One point that is becoming, I think, increasingly clear, and I think is particularly relevant to the Hispanic community, is the question of transmission mechanisms. What we have seen is that huge packages of assistance have been announced in the trillions of dollars, and that the way in which this money has been transmitted to the businesses that need them most and need them most urgently has really been a case study in bureaucratic failure and mismanagement. Now, some of this is inevitable, Claudia, because you're talking about an unprecedented situation, immense sums of money, and it's simply not a simple thing to kind of transmit those quantities of money effectively and in the kind of time frame. But I think that increases the urgency of creating not just government agencies, but in particular, NGO-style agencies that can assist small businesses in the kind of work that is required to apply for and obtain the loans that they need on terms that make sense for them. And there is a real opportunity here to work with accounting firms, tech experts, people who are savvy in the ways of government to help, in particular, small businesses, from storefronts to businesses employing 20, 30 people, to obtain these loans. Because it's one thing if a medium or large size company has to interface with the government. They usually will have a dedicated staff of professionals in an HR department or a government relations department that can move this that can obtain these sorts of loans. But let's face it, so many businesses in the Hispanic community don't have that level of development or sophistication. So the thought that I've had in the last week while thinking about this call is whether there can be an effort perhaps backed by philanthropic money to create the kinds of expertise agencies on a not-for-profit basis that provide a vehicle for access for businesses that need them. The second aspect that I've been thinking about is the status of the undocumented workers in this crisis. And you probably saw that California has started a very small fund, I think amounting to $75 million, in order to disperse monies on a scale of $500 per applicant. That's obviously a start. It's nowhere near close to the scale, the magnitude of the problem, because as you know as well as I do, that undocumented workers simply do not have any access to government assistance, and in fact put themselves at risk if they are going to apply for that kind of access, either because it's illegal or because they have to reveal their immigration status. But this is not a legal crisis. We have to think about this as a humanitarian crisis. That is to say, you have anywhere between 11 and 22 million people who have suddenly been cut off from their livelihoods, just as they are already struggling to remain part of a society that cuts them off in so many other ways. And again, I think there's just an extraordinary opportunity for a combination of philanthropy and dedicated workers to reach out to a community whose situation is going to become only more serious. I want to echo what Gillian said, which is that I am not of the view that we are going to see a rapid recovery. We are not going to see a reboot in the economy so that we will magically rewind to February. What happened was not, what's happened over the past 3 months was not, as some have said, a medically induced coma for the economy, after which you slowly bring the patient back to his senses. It was basically a case of government stepping on an artery, the neck, so to speak, of the entire economy, and nearly strangling it to death. So the recovery is going to be quite slow and painful. Now, one issue, and I think we have to be sensitive to this, is that the parts of the economy that will recover most quickly, I think, it's going to be Wall Street. It's going to be the sides of the economy that are sophisticated, have access to capital, and access to shareholder money. But inequities and inequalities in society are going to be tremendously magnified. My sense is that what you are going to see is going to be if we do in fact start stepping out of these lockdowns, we're going to start to see a momentary sharp recovery until people start to understand that permanent damage has been sustained across the board. And the recovery from that permanent damage is going to take a long time. One last point before I go, which is that I think this lockdown has exposed a new class division in American life, and maybe in the life of people outside of the United States as well. And that's the division between those whose jobs allow them to work remotely and those whose jobs simply do not allow that. And I think by and large, many members of the Hispanic community are in that second category. One problem that we face is that many decision makers belong to the class of people who have been able to work remotely, and so have not really experienced in a immediate emotional way the impact of this crisis as an economic crisis. I think for those who are remote workers, they see COVID-19 as not only a threat, but the only threat of the last few months. I think everyone who is outside of that basket sees COVID-19 as a threat among a variety of threats. And this disjunction, this distinction politically is going to have real ramifications. Just thinking one last word on the longer term, which is that I think the election is going to come down to which candidate is best able to appeal to that second basket of voters. I call them the exposed, in terms of looking out for their economic livelihood, their freedom, and their safety, not only from from fear of disease, but their fear of want and deprivation. And so that, I think, will be the core political dynamic that will play out between now and November.
Yeah, and and there's so many things that you said that touch, like the nerve. And I think that everyone that is here that represents grassroots organizations that are on the ground, that are protecting those that have not the stamp, of the government, that are not protected by anything, would a lot of the points you said resonate with their realities. I do want to take a moment to all of you, the 6 of you, to say thank you. Thank you, because we called you 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks ago and said, like, we want to do a weekly call to bring the State of the Union to the Hispanic leaders. And I know how hard it is, but you've been here, and it provides a certainty, a safe space for all of us. And you've been there, and I want to say thank you. Thank you, Bret. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, David Navarro, to Lucia, Cristina, Ramiro, Cavezos, and Jesus Mantas. Thank you for being regular. It brings actually a place of certainty in a time of uncertainty, and I think that's important. The second thing is just to make sure that I raise the attention how important it is to be informed, but also take action. And some of the things that you said, Bret, some of those people that are like so exposed, the exposed people need a hand. So we're kicking off a month of action on Thursday to protect those that are needed the most, to make sure that the people like Ramiro, Cavezos are getting support and volunteers to do that technical assistance. Some of the things you mentioned, Edgar Carreon, who's on the line, he has a non-for-profit precisely doing what you said about how to support obtaining loans and terms and so on. So we're going to kick off this month of action on Thursday, and companies like IBM are doing an incredible set of pledges and donations, giving PTech, an educational tool for all Hispanics in Spanish and Portuguese for free. And that gives me actually the perfect bridge for Jesus Mantas, managing partner of IBM, who's here today. And again, thank you, Jesus, for being here for week after week. What's your update, please?
Yeah, no, I want to follow up on the point of however this recovery is going to go. It seems a certainty that there is going to be a bigger amount of technology into what everybody does every day, business or personal, than it was before. And one of the aspects of that is one, change habits. But this week, I think I want to make sure that everybody reflects on that technology needs to be secure, that technology needs to be trusted, and that technology needs to be human. And the reason why I start with secure is we have been tracking cybercrime. And the cybercrime is a booming business right now. It is probably one of the best businesses you could be in if you want to be making money, is cybercrime. It has increased 4,300% since February. So that is 43 times an increase in the last 3 months in terms of attacks. And one may actually think that this is happening to somebody else. But as happens with most crimes, is they end up impacting disproportionately to the people that have more needs. So I'll give you an example that I think is good for everybody to understand how this is impacting, our Hispanic community. So one of the spam email that we're tracking, basically this email is sent via phishing to everybody that is pursuing a U.S. Small Business Administration loan. So people receive an email, they actually are desperate to get this loan. They receive an email that is actually fake. Instead of giving them this loan, what this email does is install malware in their computers. So it actually enables cyber criminals to enter their computers and steal all of their information, all of their bank information, credit card information, anything that they may have in their computers is installed. Another one, is actually, it preys into, people that may not understand how the virus works. The email says, if you don't pay us a ransom, we will infect you and your family with COVID-19. So it is basically a threat via email, and some people actually do pay the ransom. One of them it portrays itself as a World Health Organization email from the Director General. And it attached documents that basically install what is called an agent Tesla malware. And what that does is the person actually thinks that it didn't work, and then they just go on. But this agent that has been installed in the computer is from that moment forward recording every keystroke that you do on your computer. So every single thing you type, it is now in the hands of a bad actor. So you can be typing email addresses, you can be typing phone numbers, you can be typing your bank account, anything that you type, and it could happen for months. That could have happened a month ago. So every single thing, if you think of that you could type on a laptop, somebody else is seeing, and they can use to basically steal your identity, steal your money, do any kind of harm. So similar one from the CDC. So this aspect of cyber criminals, as you can see, is not only like, you know, states trying to penetrate states or, you know, trying to go after big companies. Some of the casualties of these cyber attacks are actually, you know, all of us, you know, anybody that just don't pay attention. So it's really important that the technology is secured and it can prevent this. It is really important that it's trusted. I think in the study that I mentioned last week, I think we saw how 50% of the users that were using Uber or Lyft 2 months ago, today say they will not use it. And that has nothing to do with the technology. It's the fact that, can you trust, you know, the entire package, technology and the provision of services? And based on that combination, will you use it? What leads me to this third point, which is the human technologies. At the end of the day, I think the companies or the individuals that are going to do better going forward are those that not only invest in the technology side of it, but they also invest in the human side of it. You know, the combination that works is modern technology that offers all of the ways to reach consumers with people that are actually capable, trained, and skilled to use that technology to create a trusted value proposition for your clients, right? One or the other is not going to do it. Is the combination of both, is the investment on the people and the investment on the technology that is like the no-brainer going forward. And that's one of the reasons why we launched the PTEC. So since we launched it, I'll just close it on this. We're never happy because we really want to reach to 100,000 people. But just in last week, we saw the visits to the PTEC website go up by 730%. So 38,000 people have visited the site and 18,000 people have registered to actually do the training. So we're well on our way, but it's super important that our Hispanic community has the means to access internet and computing power and takes the time to get the education that will make them more relevant in a world that clearly is going to have more technology.
And I love that, and Jesus, you know, like having the pieces, and that's why it's so important that we're coordinated. It's almost like we have everyone in the leadership here to say like, okay, you're putting the educational program. One of our Hispanic Star hubs, the one in New York, is doing in the month of action, is doing routers installation. So we're fundraising. Right. They're fundraising to install 10,000 routers in the Bronx and Queens, because in order for them to be useful using your program, they need and Comcast donating the internet, they need the router. So as long as we can put the puzzles together and we say like, you do this, we do that, I think that we can strive for that. Thank you so much for your participation, Jesus, again for the last 7 weeks. We love your study. We got a number of people asking for it. I do want to ask now Lucia Alonzo from Ferox Strategies about Washington, what's happening inside the belt, and what's on the policy side that we should be happy about, sad about, or loving about.
Happy might be a stretch. As Gillian was saying, the outlook economically has dimmed a bit with independent, very knowledgeable people like Jay Powell of the Fed saying this will not necessarily be a bounce back recovery as soon as everyone hopes. Congress has taken action. As folks probably saw in the news, the House last week passed the HEROES Act, which was another attempt at what they call phase 4 of COVID relief. And that was a $3 trillion bill that has a lot for in businesses, I think, of any side to like. For example, with the Paycheck Protection Program, which I know many of us are following, that bill attempts to address a lot of the regulatory snafus that Bret was referring to earlier, better align it with other rescue provisions like the Employee Retention Tax Credit. As folks know, that was something else that was created in CARES, and you can pick one or the other to help your business, but you can't pick them both. And so small businesses in particular really struggled with that choice. And so they tried to align those. For the workers as well, they they ordered the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to implement a safety standard for COVID, which actually even a lot of businesses have called for because they don't know the rules. They don't know what their obligations are as they start to reopen and what kind of risks they face. They have also ordered more direct payments to Americans, which again, if you're at the front lines, if you cannot work from home, as Bret was saying, you are probably in a lower income job where you cannot, where you have very few choices. And so those direct payments are going to be huge. The House passed that bill last week, but unfortunately you'll see in that debate that's coming up, immigrant and Latino issues are very much at the center of that debate. For example, the Republican minority in the House, one of the ways that they tried to kind of split the House majority, the Democrats, is they wanted to remove a provision currently within the HEROES Act that would allow those direct payments to go to people with ITINs, with individual taxpayer identification numbers, rather than Social Security's numbers as under the CARES Act. And so that is seen as, all right, that's opening up direct payments to immigrants, including potentially undocumented immigrants. And so the Republicans, almost successfully, they peeled off some moderate Democrats by saying that needs to change. And so you'll see how that can change the direction of this whole debate when we're talking about what the immigrant population and the Latino population get. So that is passed, and then the question is, what does it do in the Republican-controlled Senate? The Republican-controlled Senate, they have agreed in a meeting with Mike Pence just yesterday, they sort of agreed to wait. They believe that rather than continuing to pass new aid, the economy should just be encouraged to reopen as quickly as possible. They argue that people need to get back to work and things will resume. And so you'll see, back to the hearing that Gillian was talking about today with Jay Powell, they'll try to push Jay Powell to say, yes, if we can reopen, then things will be back to normal. And the Democrats will be saying the same to Jay Powell, well, if you need more aid, we need to pass more aid more quickly to get people over this hump. And so he'll be like a magic 8-ball where they're shaking him to get the answer they want. The final thing I'll leave you with today is a lot of business owners, I referred to this earlier, are watching the liability and obligations for worker safety. So another hearing that's going on the Hill today that people should watch is in the House Education and Labor Worker Safety Subcommittee. They do have the heads of OSHA. And the Democrats, as I mentioned, have really pushed OSHA to issue binding standards to protect workers. And so again, they argue employers will know the rules of the road and employees will feel safer to come back to work. And the Republican line for a while has been, well, no, we just need more liability waivers for employers. But the fact of the matter is, OSHA, through this whole thing, OSHA has never issued binding guidance. They've issued voluntary guidance. And then in the same time, OSHA has never, through this whole pandemic, brought in any enforcement action for worker safety for COVID. They just never have. And so you hear a lot of anecdotal evidence of people being concerned, and yet OSHA has not acted. So what we're starting to see is a bipartisan coalition where, again, the Democrats want those standards that set the rules of the road, and the Republicans have even come around to that a bit and said, all right, we can have standards, but then we want some kind of liability reform on top of that. So again, everyone feels safe. The employers feel like they can bring people back to work without opening themselves up to a tsunami of lawsuits, and the employees feel safer knowing that there are some standards in place that the employers have to abide by.
And I would love to hear actually Gillian and you next week talking about like the cost for companies to do that safety, which is, like in some instances we have not discussed what is it, what does it take for a company like IBM or others to have, like their factories safe and employees and so on. So thank you so much, Lucia. For next week, I would love to hear more about like how are corporations going to, react and what are the implications for safety in general. Ramiro Cavezos, the president of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the man of the week every week. since you're holding so many small businesses, and you're literally the middleman between the Small Business Administration and more than 45,000 small businesses, if not more. Ramiro, what's your update this week? Thank you for being with us, by the way.
No, thank you, Claudia, and thank you to all the panel members and for bringing us together. Just a quick update. We have been very concerned about the exposure that many of our Latino businesses, those 4.5 million businesses, many of them that did not receive the lending from the PPP. We are working hard to find new sources of funding for them from non-traditional funders, including the private sector, state and local government, and many philanthropic arms that we have relationships with. So we are working very hard to put the resources in the liquidity that they need. Sadly, many of them are struggling, as we know, because this is now the 9th week of this COVID virus for many firms who have been closed. We did send last week to many of the Latino chambers around the country that serve as an economic oasis for their regions, for the small Latino businesses to access SBA resources, banking, community lending, CDFIs. We were able to raise money through our traditional chamber grant program and disperse those dollars to close to 100 Latino chambers around the country to help them stay afloat. Our own chamber network, there are 501c6s. They were not included in the Paycheck Protection Program. We hope that eventually they will, but in the meantime, they have rent to pay. They have employees also, like small businesses, but in their communities, they're the only source for guidance beyond our national website or our national office. So Claudia, it's a very transparent environment right now for many of our business owners. Something that was stated earlier, I know by our friends, is that according to the Economic Policy Institute, only 1 out of every 6 Latinos can work from home. So we don't have the advantages as Latinos, the 60 million Latinos in America, to have that luxury, like many of us, to work from home. There are 3 themes that are important that I'd like to conclude that were stressed by Henry Cisneros in an op-ed piece that he wrote, is that if anything, this COVID virus, this incubation period, the quarantine period, has exposed all of us. If you are a small business owner and you haven't paid your mortgage, then the owner of that real estate cannot collect money, and then that owner of the real estate cannot pay the bank, and the bank then cannot continue to do business. So we're all interdependent. So this COVID-19 virus has exposed all industries of how interdependent they are with Latino-owned businesses who are on the front lines doing business. So one domino affects the other. I think there's good news there in that now people will realize the gap that exists in our economy between the different economic strata. The second point that was stressed by Henry Cisneros is that it also exposed how dependent we are on that paycheck. Many of our employees and many of our workers were just 1 or 2 paychecks away from being impacted. You saw the long lines at food banks, Claudia, you and everyone on the panel, and how it might have been a surprise or a shock to many of us, and many of them in brand new vehicles, but it also shows how exposed we all were in our environment. So that was point number 2, is that the wage needs and the gap between our ethnic populations has also been exposed. The third point is that, it also showed that there's tremendous poverty in our community. We were not facing up to the fact that, but for this COVID virus, that many folks were exposed, unfortunately, and need help. And that's where we're all rallying together. So it leads to point number 4 for me, is this is where the Hispanic Star campaign comes in. We need to create and build as a team of Americans systemic changes in our economic fabric in our society, because this virus has shown how weak we all are and how interdependent we all are. It's not just a Latino problem. It's not just a people of color problem or it's not a problem of the large earners or wealth creators can ignore any longer, because we all need each other. So thank you, Claudia, for your advocacy. We will continue to fight for our Latino-owned businesses. Right now, we are seeing beautiful light and inspiration from the innovation that is sprung from many small Latino businesses who, because their day-to-day costs were a lot less, are changing into new industries or rebuilding their businesses with or without these small business loans. They're tenacious. They're using resources from within their family and to find a new way of operating in a very digital environment. So thank you, Claudia, for having us here with the panel. We will continue to do our part.
Thank you so much. Yes, America is made of stars, and Hispanics are one of them. And we're here to get our act together, to coordinate, to mobilize, and to make sure that we can shine soon again. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here week after week. See you next Tuesday for the weekly update. I remind you that on Thursday we're launching the month of action. Everyone has something that they can do or they can give. You can donate, you can volunteer, you can share. This is the opportunity for us. This is the only time in which we have to demonstrate that we're a community, so that we support each other, so that we help each other, so that we are aware of each other. I want to hear every time more people talking about how disproportionately Hispanics are, so that we can raise that issue, so that we can raise the solutions. So take action, do what you can. Follow the leaders, follow the IBMs of the world that are doing, like an incredible part. Every one of us can do something, and I invite you all. That's why this is the month of action. We have a month to do something, and I invite you all to do it. So see you next Tuesday, and let's actually get started on the month of action on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Adios.
Bye.